Hello, I'm Carla Hayden, the Librarian of Congress, and welcome to a very special edition of National Book Festival Presents. As many of you know and have experienced this week, our country is facing many challenges, and the continuing struggle for human rights, civil rights, and freedom dates back to our founding. And cultural institutions like libraries and museums are offering historical context, but also re-examining and continuing to look at how we present information and history to our publics and making sure that we are part of a solution on the road and not part of the problem. And so I am honored tonight and today to be joined by the Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, Dr. Lonnie Bunch. He's also and was the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And as a librarian, my first purchase very recently with online was his new book, A Fool's Errand, Creating the National Museum of African American History and Culture in the Age of Bush, Obama, and Trump. And so we appreciate you, Dr. Bunch, for being with us today. And we have a lot of things we'd like to cover. And I hope you feel free to ask me a few questions too. But I really know that people have been very interested in your perspective on what is going on. And when we planned this, we had the health crisis that was going on. And since that time, another crisis and movement. And you released a statement. If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to just read it. Although it will be a monumental task, the past is replete with examples of ordinary people working together to overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. History is a guide to a better future and demonstrates that we can become a better society, but only if we collectively demand it from each other and from institutions responsible for administering justice. Why did you think it was important for the public at this time to hear from cultural leaders like yourself?
I would argue that the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian, cultural institutions are the glue that holds a country together. They're the place that people look to for trust and for guidance. And I thought it was really important to use that trust to help people find ways to understand this moment, to find some optimism, maybe some hope, but the very least challenge them to say, this is a moment that we can't just say, we've had a million of these in the past and this too shall pass. But rather, I was hoping to say, this was a time to be able to have a tipping point in America where we could really come together as a country and address what has always been the great chasm, race and institutional racism.
Now, you said always been, and does that really, I've heard you talk about the need to not erase history, but to embrace it and look at it to understand what's going on.
I think that just like you do, the past is such a valuable tool that on the one hand, people say, is this a unique moment? They're unique characteristics, but it's not a unique moment. Whether one goes back to the violence and sense of loss of enslavement, whether one looks at the kinds of lynchings that went on in the late 19th and early 20th century, or the riots that destroyed places like the black town of Tulsa, Oklahoma, almost 100 years ago, what you see is a constant struggle between democracy and fairness and discrimination and violence to enforce that. So this is part of a long history, and you and I could name so many names of bodies of people who aren't here because they ran afoul of the criminal justice system or racism in this country. But what I also wanted people to understand is that this is a moment where you're seeing things a little differently. you're seeing not only a multiracial group of people protesting to help people understand that this is not a Black problem, it's an American problem. And then you're also seeing, at least for me, the first time seeing police chiefs, police officers saying, wait a minute, that was wrong. So there's a kind of, hopefully, a tipping point where people come together and recognize that the past should give you some hope. If people could work together to found the NAACP or work together to end slavery, then we can work together to begin to address this as well. So I find hope in history, not always optimism, but I find hope in history. And I think you must feel the same way based on sort of, what you're doing at the Library of Congress.
And that hope from history, by the hope comes from sometimes seeing that positive things did come out of very negative situations. When you think about the NAACP and
Mm-hmm.
the 1919 and what was going
Mm-hmm.
on there and why things were happening, that's the hope that comes
I
from
think so.
looking at history.
I think that in some ways, one of the strengths of looking back in history is to realize that at many places where the country became fair, many places where the country began to live up to its stated ideals, it was because of an African American experience. It was sort of the end of slavery helped us redefine and expand our notions of citizenship. So that in essence, what you see is a community that believed in an America that often didn't believe in it. And
Wow.
that I think one of the great strengths now is to draw from the strength of the past and recognize that we can struggle together and we can make changes. But recognizing that what the past tells us is this is not a sprint, it's a marathon.
Now, in your book, you mentioned that concept of African American history being American history, and how you really were able to weave that into discussions about what that museum should be.
I thought it was really important as when people ask me, should I come back to run the museum, build the new museum? I thought, you know, because we have 50 years of scholarship from John Hope Franklin and Du Bois and all these wonderful new young scholars, I realized that African American history was too important to be just in the hands of an African American community. That it really had lessons for all Americans and it really profoundly shaped everything who we are. And if you look at every presidential election, at some point race was involved, going back to the very beginning. So what I wanted to do is help people realize that understanding African American history is the best way you could understand America and understand yourself. So I didn't want people to think this was somebody else's story. I wanted them to see how this was the quintessential American story and that they don't understand themselves without understanding that story.
Do you see that concept materializing now in where we are with this point and seeing the diversity?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, that's where I'm hopeful. When you see sort of civil rights marches, you see an integrated group, but it's overwhelmingly African American. Here you're seeing a sort of more blended group, and that gives me hope that people are crossing racial lines to begin to recognize that this is a time that we need to address this because enough's enough. So I'm not naive enough to think just the march is going to change things, but my hope is that this begins to create a boil of heat that begins to touch everybody from political leaders of all parts of the country, that corporate communities think what they can do, but really people like you leading major institutions can also help us think how do these institutions help a country at a time when it's really in the greatest need.
And what's been inspiring for me was the fact that so many of the people that are part of this now are younger, and that they are realizing, oh my goodness, I can, looking back when you think about John Lewis, who was only what, 21,
Yep.
when he put on that backpack and marched across that bridge. And now they are realizing that they can have a role. And just the march of history. Well, also, I want to ask you about the impact of the image, being able to see things now. We went together, the Library of Congress and the museum, to purchase the first known photograph of Harriet Tubman. And it was used in the film, and it gave people a different perspective about her because you saw her not long after she had done all of the things that we had heard in history. You know, when you see the older picture, she's not like that. But when you see that picture, and Frederick Douglass, the most
Exactly.
photographed person, and then back to John Lewis and the images that America saw of the violence and the police. What do you could you talk about that role of seeing things?
See, I think that in some ways, the great strength is a marriage of the written word, good scholarship, good books, and the visual, whether it's a photograph or an artifact, because what that does is immediately makes it accessible to people. That you see an image and it's transformative. And I think your notion when we went into the Harriet Tubman image, that was, to me, that was transformative. I had only seen images of her as this older
Mm-hmm.
woman kind of bent over, and it
Right.
was hard to imagine Harriet Tubman, Moses leading people for freedom. But then when you saw that picture that we discovered,
You
boy,
know,
there was vibrancy, there was a look in her eye, and there was a style.
there was
Um,
style.
and so for me, imagery is really what helped history come alive to me. I first got interested in history looking at old photographs as a little kid, wondering what was their lives like? Were they happy? Were they treated fairly? And so for me, photographs and the visual literacy that we can help America have is so important because it really then builds upon the amazing scholarship in the written word. I've always thought that if I ever had one of those formal portraits ever painted, I'd have a book in my hand and a photograph in the other.
That's right. And I remember those same types of experiences looking at old photographs, family photographs. And one that has been interesting, and I don't know if you've had this experience recently, of older generations telling you about things that relate to what's happening now. One of the first photographs I remember being horrified about and wondering was seeing uh, my mother's brother in a casket at this big funeral. And as a child, we thought, oh, that was just fascinating. My brother, who they call him a brother, he's a cousin now, he's a photographer. And that was one of his first memories. But it brought back the reason why so many people were in Helena, Arkansas at
Mm-hmm.
that funeral was because he was shot by the white owner of a in 1941 of a grocery store, who shot him because he was attractive to the shop owner's daughter.
Ah, yes.
Okay, the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
1941, and they claimed that he committed suicide, and he did. And for years, that has been there. And my mother, in watching the events now, she's 88 now, talked about justice and that maybe finally that you could get that. And you've had that experience, I know, and looking back and having older people talk about it.
It's simply amazing. My mom's 92, right? And so you hear her suddenly look at an image and she'll talk about how a relative of hers was run out of Woodland, North Carolina for eyeing somebody he shouldn't have
That's
eyed,
right.
right? And you suddenly realize that it's that imagery that allows those stories to come forward. That you might not be able to get people to do that, but what it also is something that moves me about working with you, and that is it's okay to say how much our personal experiences shape us. I
Yes.
know that you've had these experiences around issues of race and gender that have really sort of inspired you, shaped you, angered you, moved you. So I'd be curious, what are the things in your own life that have kind of shaped you to where you are today?
And you can see I'm in just one room of my house, and every room except the restrooms has reading material because I'm a child of books. I was made by books. And one of my earliest experiences, and I've brought it here because it was seeing myself for the first time in a book, something that I
Ah,
loved so much, books and reading, but I never saw any person that looked like me. And that was something that had, but also as a person of color coming from the tradition in this country of denying people of color the right to read. Frederick Douglass talks about that so eloquently. You know, once you learn to read, you'll be forever free. And that has resonated with me, that the power, there's a reason why they didn't want slaves to read. There was a reason why you had to limit literacy.
the ability to imagine a world yet discovered is part of what comes out of reading. And as you're trying to control people, the one thing you don't want them to do is to imagine possibilities. And so, like you, I was fascinated by reading as a kid, partly because I grew up in a neighborhood where, until high school, there were no other black kids in the school. So it meant that my
Wow.
brother went to the school by ourselves, and it was a town in North Jersey. And what I remember is sort of trying to figure out why some people treated me fairly and some people didn't. And reading became my way to do this. And it's funny, something happened the other day, literally yesterday. Somebody from that I went to high school with sent me a story about he had written about something that happened with us, that at our high school graduation, he was white, I'm black. At our high school graduation, we went to a party, and when the mother of the daughter came out, she kicked me out of the party. Black people shouldn't be at the party. And I had forgotten about it. And he talked about how that turned him to think about fairness and social justice. And growing up in that town, I think maybe more than anything else, it stimulated my interest in learning more about African American history, but it also stimulated my interest in using history to fight for fairness.
Ah.
As somebody who felt unfairness, you really find yourself saying, how do I do work that helps to make sure everybody gets the opportunities that we had? And so I think in some ways it's interesting. We were raised, both of us were taught, going through graduate school, to be objective, to step back. But it's the personal that I think gives us both the fire to move forward.
And in institutions that have been known to present information, to present history. So, do you mind if I read another part of your book? Because this is one of my
Please.
favorites. And it's a one can tell a great deal about a country by what it remembers, by what graces the walls of its museums, and what monuments have privileged placement in parks and central traffic intersections, and what holidays and patriotic songs are for generations to come. Yet one learns even more about a nation by what it forgets. What moments of evil, disappointment, and defeat are downplayed or eliminated from national narratives. And that part is something that I think we both work on, telling the
Absolutely.
story.
I think telling the story, right? Helping people to remember. I really think that, when we look at things like Confederate monuments and how people sort of celebrate that as part of Southern heritage, I don't have any problem if you do that, if you recognize that one, that symbolizes traitors going against what was the Union. And that in essence, what I wanted people to realize is when you look at Confederate monuments, they're less about the Confederacy and more about how do you preserve segregation in the late 19th and early 20th century. So for me, history is an opportunity to sort of right some wrongs, make some history
Mhm.
more clear. Because I think the other thing that I've learned from you is that people have, if we give them the right opportunities to learn and educate, people have a capacity to deal with difficult issues and to see
Yes.
things in a way. And so that to me is really part of the challenge of our institutions, which is to sort of, on the one hand, recognize that, these are old institutions that have been shaped by a lot of traditions, but they have a responsibility, I think, to help a country be made better, to help people find truth, to help people remember, to help people deal with difficult issues. I think one of the things I love about what you do at the Library of Congress is that part of what you're doing is helping people embrace ambiguity, not just looking for simple answers to complex questions, but to look at the literature, look at the imagery, and recognize that it's all about subtlety and nuance. And what a greater country we would be if we understood subtlety and nuance and ambiguity.
And what better person to exemplify that than Rosa Parks? And we joined together. The Smithsonian loaned one of her dresses that she was a seamstress and she had that, but and you loaned that dress, and then we had the photos of her in that dress, but in her own hand. It was called In Her Own Hand, and you see that she was not this quiet little lady with a purse that was tired. She was sick and tired of being tired. She was an activist, and to be able to present that,
I mean, I
people
think
don't
that's
realize.
really the power of what we can do, right? You take a story like Rosa Parks, and the prevailing notion was she was just tired and sat down and didn't get up. But you look at her life, being active in fighting against sexual violence against Black women in the 1940s, being involved in the NAACP, and suddenly you see a story that's much richer. And in some ways, a story of someone who's much braver than you give her credit for. So I
Right.
love the fact that we were able to do that together.
And that's where I'm seeing more of an opportunity to have those partnerships, to be able to not only have the dress and see the photos of her in it, but also the Polaroid years later where she's doing a yoga pose because she had health problems because of the hardships that she suffered after being that. And just to show people in all of their glory and all of their doubts, and
Exactly.
that these great people that we look up to were people, and that
Exactly.
it's attainable. And you've done that in so many ways. Now, in your new role and it's not new actually, you're coming back home, right, to the Smithsonian.
Right. Right.
How do you see that shaping up?
Well, I mean, I think that um, you know, building the African American Museum, it really was about how did all of us give a gift to America, right? A gift of understanding itself better through the African American lens. And I'm so proud of all the people that worked to help make that a reality. Those that worked in the place, those that shared their scholarship, those that shared their collections. And then sort of becoming secretary was really something where I realized that at that stage in my career, there was nothing I needed. I built a building,
Mhm.
I'm more visible than any historian should be. But this was an opportunity to sort of thank the Smithsonian for giving me not just a career, but a calling. Um, I've always been struck by something that happened in my family, if you don't mind another family
Oh no,
story.
I think it's important to.
So during the 1960s, it was the centennial of the Civil War. And I was like, a 10, 11-year-old kid, really excited about the Civil War, reading everything I could. And one Easter, we were going from my home in New Jersey to visit my mother's family in North Carolina. And as we got near Richmond and Petersburg, I saw signs for museums and Civil War battlefields. And I said to my dad, "Oh, listen, can we stop? This is great." And he had an excuse. I got to go 20 more miles to get gas or whatever.
Mhm.
And he never did. And so on the way back, he drove right past. But instead of driving straight to New Jersey, he pulled into Washington and pulled in front of the Smithsonian. And he said, "Here is a place where you could understand yourself, your past, your history, in a way that is fair, but is a way that you will not be judged by the color of your skin." And I never forgot that what that Smithsonian meant, a place of possibility for a 10, 11-year-old kid. So being secretary was really my way to thank the Smithsonian for giving me a place to believe in the past, but maybe to believe in the future. And so
It's
that's why I'm committed to making the Smithsonian be a place that matters to people, not just in traditional ways, but in ways that help them live their lives.
And I have to tell you, Lonnie, that resonates so much with me in terms of the position that I'm in now as Librarian of Congress. I had taught librarians to get out there. Power to the information is power. And public libraries and in Baltimore during the Unrest, putting up those libraries, all of that. And to be in the largest library in the world that has treasures untold, opening up that to everyone, for scholars, for the young people, for everyone to open up this wonderful library is a privilege. And I also see it as part of that joy that I had when I went in there and saw Bright April. What if we make us all available? And so I just have to, I know we have to wrap up, and I wish we could keep going, and we will, but I wonder what you think from your perspective as a historian. What do you think will be remembered of 2020? I mean, there's the pandemic,
It's a, I mean, to have a dual pandemic of virus and racism, that I think that's going to shape the way people are thinking about it. I think people will remember the protest. They'll remember the murder of George Floyd. I think that what you'll also see though is people remembering that they could find hope by coming together, by protesting, hopefully by encouraging political leadership and leadership at the local levels to affect change. I think what you will find, what you will see when people look back, is a sense of, either it's going to be a sense of possibility and hope, or it's going to be a sense of failed expectations. That this too was just another moment that people got exercised over, people wrote books about, but that it really didn't transform. And I don't think we know yet which way it's going to go. But I think what I learned from this more than anything else is working with people like you who recognize that the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian, has to be as much about today and tomorrow as it is about yesterday. And I think that's what's, to me, that's the power of the institutions we're in.
And that's also the challenge when you think about in this virtual world. What and you're at the museum, what items, what things would you have your curators thinking about collecting from this time? And that's what would you
Right.
think?
I mean, I think it's kind of like you did in Baltimore. You're going to have to collect social media.
Yes.
What you do is collect the videos that people made of the different demonstrations. What I almost think needs to happen at this moment is almost like the WPA and the slave narratives. This
Mm.
is an interesting time. In fact, it's one of the things I'm going to come talk to you about. Is that
Right.
we
We
might
could work.
come together and figure out how are there ways virtually we can capture these stories so that they'll be available for generations
Yeah.
down the road.
And that's we 836 miles of shelving that the Library of Congress has, and manuscripts and all of this. But you're so right in looking at, when we're talking about the digital future, what we're doing now. How will
Exactly.
we make sure that people 30, 40, 50 years from now that want to know more about what is happening in this time? And so when you think about what has touched you the most about the protests, I mentioned just seeing the young people and being inspired as someone who is maturing. It's good to know that
Yeah.
there are young people. What are the things that have been touching you?
Well, there's both things that are optimistic and negative. I mean, I think that candidly, I've said this, seeing another black man die made me realize that how many black people had their last breath taken by a rope, a bullet, or a knee. And I realized that on the one hand, I'm fortunate, right? But on the other hand, as a black male, you never know when your luck runs out. You never know whether you turn left instead of right. Look what you run into. So it made me, this became much more personal than I might have thought. It made me worry about my grandson's future and the like. But the positive is the same thing you took away, that to see people cross these lines to say Black Lives Matter, saying that this is not something that is business as usual. It inspires me. What I worry? I worry that during the '60s when there were all these marches, you had things like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to make sure they had an impact and they were part of a strategic vision. That's what's missing to me right now. But I am unbelievably hopeful watching people say, like Langston Hughes said, let America be America, and we'll be on the streets to help that happen.
And we'll be making sure that we preserve it and capture it and make it available so that if and hopefully the future will be brighter. I have to end on a personal one for me too. When you say what happened, I mentioned my mom and that far way case. She said, you know, maybe we could finally get a headstone for Jimmy because her mother never got to do that. She died of a heartbreak basically after. Maybe we could go and do that. And I said, okay, that's good.
That's
And
powerful.
she said, justice. So
justice. That gave me chills.
that's what she said. Maybe justice for Jimmy. So I want to thank you so much. I know this is a trying time, but if you want, and just for our people who've joined us, we both have websites, loc.gov for the Library of Congress and Smithsonian Institution.edu. And there's so many things because the Smithsonian has even started a special portal, right? Talking about race.
The American History Museum has this portal. The Museum of African American History and Culture has a portal that says, here is things that helps you talk about race. Here are scholars, experts you can talk to. So in some ways, like you, we want both of these institutions to be of value, to be relevant, to fulfill their missions of collecting and remembering, but to give people tools to live their lives. And that's what I think we both want to do.
Oh, thank you, Lonnie. I couldn't have a better partner. And
I am so lucky to have you there. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank everyone and take care.
Take care now.